Third section of Fundamental Principles of the Metaphysic of Morals. Recording by Drew Moore. Fundamental Principles of the Metaphysic of Morals by Immanuel Kant. Translated by Thomas Kingsmill Abbott. Third section. Third section. Transition from the metaphysic of morals to the critique of pure practical reason. The concept of freedom is the key that explains the autonomy of the will. The will is a kind of causality belonging to living beings insofar as they are rational, and freedom would be this property of such causality, that it can be efficient, independently of foreign causes determining it, just as physical necessity is the property that the causality of all irrational beings has of being determined to activity by the influence of foreign causes. The preceding definition of freedom is negative and therefore unfruitful for the discovery of its essence, but it leads to a positive conception which is so much the more full and fruitful. Since the conception of causality involves that of laws, according to which, by something we call cause, something else, namely the effect, must be produced. Hence, although freedom is not a property of the will depending on physical laws, yet it is not for that reason lawless. On the contrary, it must be a causality acting according to immutable laws, but of a peculiar kind. Otherwise, a free will would be an absurdity. Physical necessity is a heteronomy of the efficient causes, for every effect is possible only according to this law, that something else determines the efficient cause to exert its causality. What else, then, can freedom of the will be but autonomy, that is, the property of the will to be a law to itself? But the proposition, "the will is in every action a law to itself," only expresses the principle, to act on no other maxim than that which can also have as an object itself as a universal law. Now, this is precisely the formula of the categorical imperative and is the principle of morality, so that a free will and a will subject to moral laws are one and the same. On this hypothesis, then, of the freedom of the will, morality, together with its principle, follows from it by mere analysis of the conception. However, the latter is a synthetic proposition, viz., an absolutely good will is that whose maxim can always include itself, regarded as a universal law. For this property of its maxim can never be discovered by analyzing the conception of an absolutely good will. Now, such synthetic propositions are only possible in this way, that the two cognitions are connected together by their union with a third in which they are both to be found. The positive concept of freedom furnishes this third cognition, which cannot, as with physical causes, be the nature of the sensible world, in the concept of which we find conjoined the concept of something in relation as cause to something else as effect. We cannot now at once show what this third is to which freedom points us, and of which we have an idea a priori, nor can we make intelligible how the concept of freedom is shown to be legitimate from principles of pure practical reason, and with it the possibility of a categorical imperative. But some further preparation is required. Freedom must be presupposed as a property of the will of all rational beings. It is not enough to predicate freedom of our own will, from whatever reason, if we have not sufficient grounds for predicating the same of all rational beings. For as morality serves as a law for us only because we are rational beings, it must also hold for all rational beings. And as it must be deduced simply from the property of freedom, it must be shown that freedom also is a property of all rational beings. It is not enough, then, to prove it from certain supposed experiences of human nature, which indeed is quite impossible, and it can only be shown a priori, but we must show that it belongs to the activity of all rational beings endowed with a will. Now, I say, every being that cannot act except under the idea of freedom is just for that reason, in a practical point of view, really free. That is to say, all laws which are inseparably connected with freedom have the same force for him as if his will had been shown to be free in itself by a proof theoretically conclusive. Now I affirm that we must attribute to every rational being which has a will that it has also the idea of freedom and acts entirely under this idea, for in such a being we conceive a reason that is practical, that is, has causality in reference to its objects. Now, we cannot possibly conceive a reason consciously receiving a bias from any other quarter with respect to its judgments, for then the subject would ascribe the determination of its judgment not to its own reason, but to an impulse. It must regard itself as the author of its principles independent of foreign influences. Consequently, as practical reason or as the will of a rational being, it must regard itself as free, that is to say, the will of such a being cannot be a will of its own except under the idea of freedom. This idea must therefore, in a practical point of view, be ascribed to every rational being. I adopt this message of assuming freedom merely as an idea which rational beings suppose in their actions. in order to avoid the necessity of proving it in its theoretical aspect also. The former is sufficient for my purpose, for even though the speculative proof should not be made out, yet a being that cannot act except with the idea of freedom is bound by the same laws that would oblige a being who is actually free. Thus we can escape here from the onus which presses on the theory of the interest attaching to the ideas of morality. We have finally reduced the definite conception of morality to the idea of freedom. This latter, however, we could not prove to be actually a property of ourselves or of human nature. Only we saw that it must be presupposed if we would conceive a being as rational and conscious of its causality in respect of its actions, i.e., as endowed with a will. And so we find that on just the same grounds we must ascribe to every being endowed with reason and will this attribute of determining itself to action under the idea of its freedom. Now, it resulted also from the presupposition of these ideas that we became aware of a law that the subjective principles of action, i.e. maxims, must always be so assumed that they can also hold as objective, that is, universal principles, and so serve as universal laws of our own dictation. But why then should I subject myself to this principle, and that simply as a rational being, thus also subjecting to it all other being endowed with reason? I will allow that no interest urges me to this, for that would not give a categorical imperative, but I must take an interest in it and discern how this comes to pass. For this properly an I ought is properly an I would, valid for every rational being, provided only that reason determine his actions without any hindrance. But for beings that are in addition affected, as we are, by springs of a different kind, namely sensibility, and in whose case that is not always done which reason alone would do, for these that necessity is expressed only as an ought, and the subjective necessity is different from the objective. It seems then as if the moral law, that is, the principle of autonomy of the will, were properly speaking only presupposed in the idea of freedom, and as if we could not prove its reality and objective necessity independently. In that case we should still have gained something considerable by at least determining the true principle more exactly than had previously been done. But as regards its validity and the practical necessity of subjecting oneself to it, we should not have advanced a step. For if we were asked why the universal validity of our maxim as a law must be the condition restricting our actions, and on what we ground the worth which we assign to this manner of acting, a worth so great that there cannot be any higher interest, and if we were asked further how it happens that it is by this alone a man believes he feels his own personal worth, in comparison with which that of an agreeable or disagreeable condition is to be regarded as nothing, to these questions we could give no satisfactory answer. We find indeed sometimes that we can take an interest in a personal quality which does not involve any interest of external condition, provided this quality makes us capable of participating in the condition in case reason were to affect the allotment, that is to say, if mere being worthy of happiness can interest of itself, even without the motive of participating in this happiness. This judgment, however, is in fact only the effect of the importance of the moral law which we before presupposed, when by the idea of freedom we detach ourselves from every empirical interest. But that we ought to detach ourselves from these interests, i.e., to consider ourselves as free in action, and yet as subject to certain laws, so as to find a worth simply in our own person which can compensate us for the loss of everything that gives worth to our condition. This we are not yet able to discern in this way, nor do we see how it is possible so to act. In other words, whence the moral law derives its obligation. It must be freely admitted that there is a sort of circle here from which it seems impossible to escape. In order of the efficient causes we assume ourselves free, in order that in the order of ends we may conceive ourselves as subject to moral laws, and we afterwards conceive ourselves as subject to these laws, because we have attributed to ourselves freedom of will. For freedom and self-legislation of will are both autonomy, and therefore are reciprocal conceptions, and for this very reason one must not be used to explain the other or give the reason of it, but at most only logical purposes to reduce apparently different notions of the same object to one single concept, as we reduce different fractions of the same value to the lowest terms. One resource remains to us, namely, to inquire whether we do not occupy different points of view when by means of freedom we think ourselves as causes efficient a priori, and when we form our conception of ourselves from our actions as effects which we see before our eyes. It is a remark which needs no subtle reflection to make, but which we may assume that even the commonest understanding can make, although it be after its fashion by an obscure discernment of judgment which it calls feeling, that all the ideas that come to us involuntarily, as those of the senses, do not enable us to know objects otherwise than as they affect us, so that what they may be in themselves remains unknown to us, and consequently that as regards ideas of this kind, even with the closest attention and clearness that the understanding can apply to them, we can by them only attain the knowledge of appearances, never to that of things in themselves. As soon as this distinction has once been made, perhaps merely in consequence of the difference observed between the ideas given us from without, and in which we are passive, and those that we produce simply from ourselves, and in which we show our own activity, then it follows of itself that we must admit and assume behind the appearance something else that is not an appearance, namely, the things in themselves. Although we must admit that as they can never be known to us except as they affect us, we can come no nearer to them, nor can we ever know what they are in themselves. This must furnish a distinction, however crude, between a world of sense and the world of understanding, in which the former may be different according to the difference of the sensuous impressions in various observers, while the second, which is its basis, always remains the same. Even as to himself, a man cannot pretend to know what he is in himself from the knowledge he has by internal sensation, whereas he does not, as it were, create himself, and does not come by the conception of himself a priori, but empirically. It naturally follows that he can obtain his knowledge even of himself only by the inner sense, and consequently only through the appearances of his nature, and by the way in which his consciousness is affected. At the same time, beyond these characteristics of his own subject, made up of mere appearances, he must necessarily suppose something else as their basis, namely his ego, whatever its characteristics in itself may be. Thus, in respect to mere perception and receptivity of sensations, he must reckon himself as belonging to the world of sense. But in respect of whatever there may be of pure activity in him, that which reaches consciousness immediately and not through affecting the senses, he must reckon himself as belonging to the intellectual world, of which, however, he has no further knowledge. To such a conclusion, the reflecting man must come with respect to all the things which can be presented to him. It is probably to be met with even in persons of the commonest understanding, who, as is well known, are very much inclined to suppose behind the objects of the senses something else invisible and acting of itself. They spoil it, however, by presently sensualizing this invisible again, that is to say, wanting to make it an object of intuition, so that they do not become a whit the wiser. Now man really finds in himself a faculty by which he distinguishes himself from everything else, even from himself as affected by objects, and that is reason. This being pure spontaneity, and is even elevated above the understanding. For although the latter is a spontaneity and does not, like sense, merely contain intuitions that arise when we are affected by things, and are therefore passive, yet it cannot produce from its activity any other conceptions than those which merely serve to bring the intuitions of sense under rules, and thereby to unite them in one consciousness. And without this use of the sensibility it could not think at all, whereas, on the contrary, reason shows so pure a spontaneity in the case of what I call ideas, ideal conceptions, that it thereby far transcends everything that the sensibility can give it, and exhibits its most important function in distinguishing the world of sense from that of understanding, and thereby prescribing the limits of the understanding itself. For this reason, a rational being must regard himself qua intelligence, not from the side of his lower faculties, as belonging not to the world of sense but to that of understanding. Hence he has 2 points of view from which he can regard himself, and recognize laws of the exercise of his faculties, and consequently of all his actions. First, so far as he belongs to the world of sense, he finds himself subject to the laws of nature, heteronomy. Secondly, as belonging to the intelligible world, under laws which, being independent of nature, have their foundation not in experience but in reason alone. As a rational being, and consequently belonging to the intelligible world, man can never conceive the causality of his own will otherwise than on condition of the idea of freedom. For independence of the determinate causes of the sensible world, an independence which reason must always ascribe to itself, is freedom. Now, the idea of freedom is inseparably connected with the conception of autonomy, and this again with the universal principle of morality, which is ideally the foundation of all actions of rational beings, just as the law of nature is of all phenomena. Now the suspicion is removed which we raised above, that there was a latent circle involved in our reasoning from freedom to autonomy, and from this to the moral law, viz., that we laid down the idea of freedom because of the moral law, only that we might afterwards in turn infer the latter from freedom, and that consequently we could assign no reason at all for this law, but could only present it as a petitio principii, which well-disposed minds would gladly concede to us, but which we could never put forward as a provable proposition. For now we see that when we conceive ourselves as free, we transfer ourselves into the world of understanding as members of it, and recognize the autonomy of the will with its consequence, morality. Whereas, if we conceive ourselves as under obligation, we consider ourselves as belonging to the world of sense, and at the same time to the world of understanding. How is a categorical imperative possible? Every rational being reckons himself qua intelligence as belonging to the world of understanding, and it is simply as an efficient cause belonging to that world that he calls his causality a will. On the other side, he is also conscious of himself as a part of the world of sense in which his actions, which are mere appearances, phenomena of that causality, are displayed. We cannot, however, discern how they are possible from this causality which we do not know. But instead of that, these actions, as belonging to the sensible world, must be viewed as determined by other phenomena, namely, desires and inclinations. If, therefore, I were only a member of the world of understanding, then all my actions would perfectly conform to the principle of autonomy of the pure will. If I were only a part of the world of sense, they would necessarily be assumed to conform wholly to the natural law of desires and inclinations, in other words, to the heteronomy of nature. The former would rest on morality as the supreme principle, the latter on happiness. Since, however, the world of understanding contains the foundation of the world of sense, and consequently of its laws also, and accordingly gives the law to my will, which belongs wholly to the world of understanding, directly, and must be conceived as doing so, it follows that, although on the one side I must regard myself as a being belonging to the world of sense, yet on the other side I must recognize myself as subject, as an intelligence, to the law of the world of understanding, i.e., to reason, which contains this law in the idea of freedom, and therefore as subject to the autonomy of the will. Consequently, I must regard the laws of the world of understanding as imperatives for me, and the actions which conform to them as duties. And thus what makes categorical imperatives possible is this, that the idea of freedom makes me a member of an intelligible world, in consequence of which, if I were nothing else, all my actions would always conform to the autonomy of the will. But as I at the same time intuit myself as a member of the world of sense, they ought so to conform, and this categorical ought implies a synthetic a priori proposition, inasmuch as besides my will as affected by sensible desires, there is added further the idea of the same will, but as belonging to the world of the understanding, pure and practical of itself, which contains the supreme condition according to reason of the former will. Precisely as to the intuitions of sense, there are added concepts of the understanding which of themselves signify nothing but regular form in general, and in this way synthetic a priori propositions become possible, on which all knowledge of physical nature rests. The practical use of common human reason confirms this reasoning. There is no one, not even the most consummate villain, provided only that he is otherwise accustomed to the use of reason, who, when we set before him examples of honesty of purpose, of steadfastness in following good maxims, of sympathy and general benevolence, even combined with great sacrifices of advantages and comfort, does not wish that he might also possess these qualities. Only on account of his inclinations and impulses he cannot attain this in himself, but at the same time he wishes to be free from such inclinations which are burdensome to himself. He proves by this that he transfers himself in thought, with a will free from the impulses of the sensibility, into an order of things wholly different from that of his desires in the field of the sensibility. Since he cannot expect to obtain by that wish any gratification of his desires, nor any position which would satisfy any of his actual or supposable inclinations, for this would destroy the preeminence of the very idea which wrests that wish from him, he can only expect a greater intrinsic worth of his own person. This better person, however, he imagines himself to be when he transfers himself to the point of view of a member of the world of the understanding, to which he is involuntarily forced by the idea of freedom, i.e., of independence on determining causes of the world of sense. And from this point of view he is conscious of a good will, which by his own confession constitutes the law for the bad will that he possesses as a member of the world of sense, a law whose authority he recognizes while transgressing it. What he morally ought is then what he necessarily would, as a member of the world of the understanding, and is conceived by him as an ought only inasmuch as he likewise considers himself as a member of the world of sense. Of the extreme limits of all practical philosophy. All men attribute to themselves freedom of will. Hence come all judgments upon actions as being such as ought to have been done, although they have not been done. However, this freedom is not a conception of experience, nor can it be so, since it still remains, even though experience shows the contrary, of what on supposition of freedom are conceived as its necessary consequences. On the other side, it is equally necessary that everything that takes place should be fixedly determined according to the laws of nature. This necessity of nature is likewise not an empirical conception, just for this reason, that it involves the motion of necessity and consequently of an a priori cognition, but this conception of a system of nature is confirmed by experience, and it must be inevitably presupposed if experience itself is to be possible, that is, a connected knowledge of the objects of sense resting on general laws. Therefore, freedom is only an idea of reason, and its objective reality in itself is doubtful. while nature is a concept of the understanding which proves, and must necessarily prove, its reality in examples of experience. There arises from this a dialectic of reason, since the freedom attributed to the will appears to contradict the necessity of nature, and placed between these two ways, reason for speculative purposes finds the road of physical necessity much more beaten and more appropriate than that of freedom. Yet for practical purposes the narrow footpath of freedom is the only one on which it is possible to make use of reason in our conduct. Hence it is just as impossible for the subtlest philosophy as for the commonest reason of men to argue away freedom. Philosophy must then assume that no real contradiction will be found between freedom and physical necessity of the same human actions, for it cannot give up the conception of nature any more than that of freedom. Nevertheless, even though we should never be able to comprehend how freedom is possible, we must at least remove this apparent contradiction in a convincing manner. For if the thought of freedom contradicts either itself or nature, which is equally necessary, it must in competition with physical necessity be entirely given up. It would, however, be impossible to escape this contradiction if the thinking subject, which seems to itself free, conceived itself in the same sense or in the very same relation when it calls itself free, as when in respect of the same action it assumes itself to be subject to the laws of nature. Hence, it is an indispensable problem of speculative philosophy to show that its illusion respecting the contradiction rests on this, that we think of man in a different sense and relation when we call him free, and when we regard him as subject to the laws of nature, as being part and parcel of nature. It must therefore show that not only can both these very well coexist, but that both must be thought as necessarily united in the same subject, since otherwise no reason could be given why we should burden reason with an idea which, though it may be possibly without contradiction be reconciled with another that is sufficiently established, yet entangles us in a perplexity which sorely embarrasses reason and its theoretic employment. This duty, however, belongs only to speculative philosophy. The philosopher, then, has no option whether he will remove the apparent contradiction or leave it untouched, for in the latter case the theory respecting this would be bonum vacans, into the possession of which the fatalist would have a right to enter and chase all morality out of its supposed domain as occupying it without title. We cannot, however, as yet say that we are touching the bounds of practical philosophy, for the settlement of that controversy does not belong to it. It only demands from speculative reason that it should put an end to the discord in which it entangles itself in theoretical questions, so that practical reason may have rest and security from external attacks which might make the ground debatable on which it desires to build. The claims to freedom of will made even by common reason are founded on the consciousness and the admitted supposition that reason is independent of merely subjectively determined causes, which together constitute what belongs to sensation only, and which consequently come under the general designation of sensibility. Man, considering himself in this way as an intelligence, places himself thereby in a different order of things and in a relation to determining grounds of a wholly different kind, when on the one hand he thinks of himself as an intelligence endowed with a will, and consequently with causality, and when on the other he perceives himself as a phenomenon in the world of sense, as he really is also, and affirms that his causality is subject to external determination according to laws of nature. Now he soon becomes aware that both can hold good, nay, must hold good at the same time, for there is not the smallest contradiction in saying that a thing in appearance, belonging to the world of sense, is subject to certain laws, of which the very same as a thing or being in itself is independent, and that he must conceive and think of himself in this twofold way, rests, as to the first, on the consciousness of himself, and as an object affected through the senses, and as to the second, on the consciousness of himself as an intelligence, i.e. as independent on sensible impressions in the employment of his reason, in other words, as belonging to the world of understanding. Hence it comes to pass that man claims the possession of a will which takes no account of anything that comes under the head of desires and inclinations, and on the contrary conceives actions as possible to him, nay, even as necessary, which can only be done by discarding all desires and sensible inclinations. The causality of such actions lies in him as an intelligence and in the laws of effects and actions, which depend on the principles of an intelligible world, of which indeed he knows nothing more than that in it pure reason alone, independent of sensibility, gives the law. Moreover, since it is only in that world, as an intelligence, that he is his proper self, being as man only the appearance of himself, those laws apply to him directly and categorically, so that the incitements of inclinations and appetites, in other words, the whole nature of the world of sense, cannot impair the laws of his volition as an intelligence. Nay, he does not even hold himself responsible for the former, or ascribe them to his proper self, i.e. his will. He only ascribes to his will any indulgence which he might yield them if he allowed them to influence his maxims to the prejudice of the rational laws of the will. When practical reason thinks itself into a world of understanding, it does not thereby transcend its own limits, as it would if it tried to enter it by intuition or sensation. The former is only a negative thought in respect of the world of sense, which does not give any laws to reason in determining the will, and is positive only in the single point that this freedom as a negative characteristic is at the same time conjoined with a positive faculty, and even with a causality of reason, which we designate a will, namely a faculty of so acting that the principle of the actions shall conform to the essential character of a rational motive, i.e., the condition that the maxim have universal validity as a law. But were it to borrow an object of will, that is, a motive, from the world of understanding, then it would overstep its bounds and pretend to be acquainted with something of which it knows nothing. The conception of a world of the understanding is then only a point of view which reason finds itself compelled to take outside the appearances in order to conceive itself as practical, which would not be possible if the influences of the sensibility had a determining power on man, but which is necessary unless he is to be denied the consciousness of himself as an intelligence and, consequently, as a rational cause, energizing by reason, that is, operating freely. This thought certainly involves the idea of an order and a system of laws different from that of the mechanism of nature which belongs to the sensible world, and it makes the conception of an intelligible world necessary, that is to say, the whole system of rational beings as things in themselves. But it does not in the least authorize us to think of it further than as to its formal condition only, that is, the universality of the maxims of the will as laws, and consequently the autonomy of the latter, which alone is consistent with its freedom, whereas, on the contrary, all laws that refer to a definite object give heteronomy, which only belongs to laws of nature and can only apply to the sensible world. But reason would overstep all its bounds if it undertook to explain how pure reason can be practical, which would be exactly the same problem as to explain how freedom is possible. For we can explain nothing but that which we can reduce to laws, the object of which can be given in some possible experience. But freedom is a mere idea, the objective reality of which can in no wise be shown according to laws of nature, and consequently not in any possible experience. And for this reason it can never be comprehended or understood, because we cannot support it by any sort of example or analogy. It holds good only as a necessary hypothesis of reason in a being that believes itself conscious of a will, that is, of a faculty distinct from mere desire, namely, a faculty of determining itself to action as an intelligence, in other words, by laws of reason independently on natural instincts. Now, where determination according to laws of nature ceases, there all explanation ceases also, and nothing remains but defense, i.e., the removal of the objections of those who pretend to have seen deeper into the nature of things, and thereupon boldly declare freedom impossible. We can only point out to them that the supposed contradiction that they have discovered in it arises only from this, that in order to be able to apply the law of nature to human actions, they must necessarily consider man as an appearance. Then, when we demand of them that they should also think of him qua intelligence as a thing in itself, they still persist in considering him in this respect also as an appearance. In this view, it would no doubt be a contradiction to suppose the causality of the same subject, that is, his will, to be withdrawn from all the natural laws of the sensible world. But this contradiction disappears if they would only bethink themselves and admit, as is reasonable, that behind the appearances there must also lie at their root, although hidden, the things in themselves, and that we cannot expect the laws of these to be the same as those that govern their appearances. The subjective impossibility of explaining the freedom of the will is identical with the impossibility of discovering and explaining an interest which man can take up in the moral law. Nevertheless, he does actually take an interest in it, the basis of which in us we call the moral feeling, which some have falsely assigned as the standard of our moral judgment, whereas it must rather be viewed as the subjective effect that the law exercises on the will, the objective principle of which is furnished by reason alone. Interest is that by which reason becomes practical, i.e., a cause determining the will. Hence, we say of rational beings only that they take an interest in a thing. Irrational beings only feel sensual appetites. Reason takes a direct interest in action, and only when the universal validity of its maxims is alone sufficient to determine the will. Such an interest alone is pure. But if it can determine the will only by means of another object of desire, or on the suggestion of a particular feeling of the subject, then reason takes only an indirect interest in the action, and as reason by itself without experience cannot discover either objects of the will or a special feeling actuating it, this latter interest would only be empirical and not a pure rational interest. The logical interest of reason namely, to extend its insight, is never direct, but presupposes purposes for which reason is employed. In order, indeed, that a rational being who is also affected through the senses should will what reason alone directs such beings that they ought to will, it is no doubt requisite that reason should have a power to infuse a feeling of pleasure or satisfaction in the fulfillment of duty. That is to say, that it should have a causality by which it determines the sensibility according to its own principles. But it is quite impossible to discern, i.e., to make it intelligible a priori, how a mere thought, which itself contains nothing sensible, can itself produce a sensation of pleasure or pain, for this is a particular kind of causality, of which, as every other causality, we can determine nothing whatever a priori. We must only consult experience about it. But as this cannot supply us with any relation of cause and effect except between two objects of experience, whereas in this case, although indeed the effects produced lies within experience, yet the cause is supposed to be pure reason acting through mere ideas which offer no object to experience. It follows that for us men it is quite impossible to explain how and why the universality of the maxim as a law, that is, morality, interests. This only is certain, that it is not because it interests us that it has validity for us, for that would be a heteronomy and dependence of practical reason on sensibility, namely, on a feeling that its principle, in which case it could never give moral laws, but that it interests us because it is valid for us as men, inasmuch as it had its source in our will as intelligences, in other words, in our proper self, and what belongs to mere appearances is necessarily subordinated by reason to the nature of the thing in itself. The question, then, how a categorical imperative is possible, can be answered to this extent, that we can assign the only hypothesis on which it is possible, namely, the idea of freedom, and we can also discern the necessity of this hypothesis, and this is sufficient for the practical exercise of reason, that is, for the conviction that the validity of this imperative, and hence of the moral law, but how this hypothesis itself is possible can never be discerned by any human reason. On the hypothesis, however, that the will of an intelligence is free, its autonomy, as the essential formal condition of its determination, is a necessary consequence. Moreover, this freedom of will is not merely quite possible as a hypothesis, not involving any contradiction to the principle of physical necessity in the connection of the phenomena of the sensible world, as speculative philosophy can show, but further, a rational being who is conscious of causality through reason, that is to say, of a will, distinct from desires, must of necessity make it practically, that is, an idea, the condition of all his voluntary actions. But to explain how pure reason can be of itself practical without the aid of any spring of action that can be derived from any other source, i.e., how the mere principle of the universal validity of all its maxims as laws, which would certainly be the form of a pure practical reason, can of itself supply a spring without any matter, object of the will, in which one could antecedently take any interest, and how it can produce an interest which would be called purely moral, or in other words, how pure reason can be practical. To explain this is beyond the power of human reason, and all the labor and pains of seeking an explanation of it are lost. It is just the same as if I sought to find out how freedom itself is possible as the causality of a will, for then I quit the ground of philosophical explanation, and I have no other to go upon. I might indeed revel in the world of intelligences, which still remains to me, but although I have an idea of it which is well founded, yet I have not the least knowledge of it, nor can I ever attain to such knowledge with all the efforts of my natural faculty of reason. It signifies only a something that remains over when I have eliminated everything belonging to the world of sense from the actuating principles of my will, serving merely to keep in bounds the principle of motives taken from the field of sensibility, fixing its limits and showing that it does not contain all in all within itself, but that there is more beyond it. But this something more I know no further. Of pure reason, which frames this ideal, there remains, after the abstraction of all matter, i.e., knowledge of objects, nothing but the form, namely, the practical law of the universality of the maxims, and in conformity with this conception of reason in reference to a pure world of understanding as a possible efficient cause, that is a cause determining the will. There must here be a total absence of springs, unless this idea of an intelligible world is itself the spring, or that in which reason primarily takes an interest. But to make this intelligible is precisely the problem that we cannot solve. Here now is the extreme limit of all moral inquiry, and it is of great importance to determine it even on this account, in order that reason may not on the one hand, to the prejudice of morals, seek about in the world of sense for the supreme motive and an interest comprehensible but empirical, but on the other hand, that it may not impotently flap its wings without being able to move in the, for it, empty space of transcendent concepts which we call the intelligible world, and so lose itself amidst chimeras. For the rest, the idea of a pure world of understanding as a system of all intelligences, and to which we ourselves as rational beings belong, although we are likewise on the other side members of the sensible world, this remains always a useful and legitimate idea for the purposes of rational belief, although all knowledge stops at its threshold, useful, namely, to produce in us a lively interest in the moral law by means of the noble ideal of a universal kingdom of ends in themselves, rational beings, to which we can belong as members, then, only when we carefully conduct ourselves according to the maxims of freedom, as if they were laws of nature. Concluding remark. The speculative employment of reason with respect to nature leads to the absolute necessity of some supreme cause of the world. The practical employment of reason with a view to freedom leads also to absolute necessity, but only of the laws of the actions of a rational being as such. Now, it is an essential principle of reason, however employed, to push its knowledge to a consciousness of its necessity, without which it would not be rational knowledge. It is, however, an equally essential restriction of the same reason that it can neither discern the necessity of what is or what happens, nor of what ought to happen, unless a condition is supposed on which it is or happens or ought to happen. In this way, however, by the constant inquiry for the condition, the satisfaction of reason is only further and further postponed. Hence it unceasingly seeks the unconditionally necessary and finds itself forced to assume it, although without any means of making it comprehensible to itself. Happy enough if only it can discover a conception which agrees with this assumption. It is therefore no fault in our deduction of the supreme principle of morality, but an objection that should be made to human reason in general, that it cannot enable us to conceive the absolute necessity of an unconditional practical law, such as the categorical imperative must be. It cannot be blamed for refusing to explain this necessity by a condition, that is to say, by means of some interest assumed as a basis, since the law would then cease to be a supreme law of reason. And thus, while we do not comprehend the practical unconditional necessity of the moral imperative, we yet comprehend its incomprehensibility, and this is all that can be fairly demanded of a philosophy which strives to carry its principles up to the very limit of human reason. The end. End of Section 3. Recording by Drew Moore, Chicago, Illinois. End of Fundamental Principles of the Metaphysic of Morals by Immanuel Kant. Translated by Thomas Kingsmill Abbott.